I'd been on the road since just after 9 that evening, which in hindsight was already later than I should have started. The plan had been to leave Atlanta by 7, but I'd spent too long saying goodbye to my sister and her husband, too long standing in their driveway pretending I wasn't in any kind of hurry, and by the time I finally got moving, the sun had already gone down and the city lights were fading in my rearview mirror. I had about 5 hours ahead of me, nothing I hadn't done before. I told myself it would be fine. Central Georgia at night is a particular kind of dark. People who haven't driven it don't really understand what I mean when I say that, but anyone who has knows. Once you clear the suburbs south of the city and get onto the 2-lane state routes that cut through the pine flatlands, the darkness has a texture to it. The trees press in from both sides tall, straight loblolly pines planted in rows so tight they form a kind of wall, and the road signs come less frequently, and the radio stations start to bleed into each other. Country bleeding into gospel, bleeding into static, and the whole effect is that you begin to feel less like you're driving through Georgia and more like you're driving through some quiet, lightless corridor between one world and the next. I had a podcast playing. I had a travel mug of coffee in the cup holder that had gone lukewarm somewhere around Griffin. I had my phone mounted on the dash, showing me a route I already knew well enough not to need it. These were the things I used to keep myself anchored to the ordinary. I've always done that on late drives, built a little architecture of the familiar around myself to push back against whatever the darkness outside wants to suggest. The headlights appeared in my rearview mirror somewhere past the Barnesville exit, around 1:15 midnight. I registered them the way you register most things on an empty highway at night peripherally, without much thought. A vehicle some distance behind me, keeping pace. Probably somebody else is making a late run south. I turned the podcast up a little and let my attention drift back to the road ahead. But something made me check the mirror again a few minutes later. Then again, after that, each time, the headlights were in the same position. Not closer, not farther. The same fixed distance behind me, as precise as if measured. I noted that they were old-style headlights set low and wide, with that particular amber warmth that the sealed beam lights on older vehicles have. Nothing like the crisp white LEDs you see on modern trucks. Whatever was behind me had age on it. Probably a work truck, I thought. Probably some farmer heading home. I pressed the accelerator and brought my speed up to 73, 75. The headlights kept pace without apparent effort. I watched them in the mirror for a full mile, and they didn't shift by a car length in either direction. I eased off the gas until I was doing under 50. On a 2-lane highway, doing 50 at midnight, any normal driver behind you is going to ride your bumper, going to flash their lights, going to get impatient and wait for the first passing zone and go around you. The headlights fell back proportionally and held their new distance like water finding its level. Same gap, same stillness. My hands had tightened on the wheel without my noticing. I forced them to relax, one at a time. I told myself what I always tell myself in the early stages of something I don't want to be afraid of. I told myself there was an explanation. I know how it feels to drive late and tired. I know how your eyes will lock onto the taillights of the car ahead and how that car becomes a kind of anchor, something to follow so you don't have to think about steering or staying in your lane. I told myself this person was tired. I told myself they were grateful for my lights. I told myself this was nothing. I gave it another 20 minutes. Then I took the rest stop exit outside of Macon. It wasn't a planned stop. I didn't need gas or the bathroom. I pulled off specifically to see what the truck would do, because by then I understood that I needed to know. The rest stop was a small one, a pair of low concrete buildings set back from a parking lot with maybe a dozen spaces, a row of vending machines under a yellowed fluorescent canopy, a few scraggly crepe myrtles planted along a median strip. 3 or 4 other vehicles were parked there, all dark and still, their occupants presumably asleep. I pulled into a space near the center of the lot, turned off my headlights, and killed the engine. My eyes went immediately to the rearview mirror. The truck had slowed at the entrance. I could see its headlights there at the top of the ramp, that low, amber-tinted pair, and for a moment I thought it would just continue on the highway, that it would pass without turning in, and I would sit there feeling foolish and relieved. But it turned. It came down the ramp slowly, more slowly than you'd expect even from someone being careful, and rolled into the lot. It was parked 2 spaces to my left. I want to be precise about this because it matters. There were 9 or 10 open spaces in that lot. The truck bypassed all of them and chose a space 2 removed from mine, which put it close enough that I could hear, when the engine finally went quiet, the tick and pop of hot metal beginning to cool. Then nothing. I sat there with my door locked. I'd locked it when I turned in, and my phone in my left hand with my sister's number pulled up on the screen, ready to call, though I didn't know what I would tell her if she picked up. I could see the outline of the truck in my peripheral vision. It was an older model, maybe a late 70s or early 80s full-size. One of the big American pickups that people in these parts still drive without irony. Dark-colored, though I couldn't say for certain whether it was navy or black or just a deep faded green. The cab was a single row, no extended section. There was no one visible through the rear window. I watched the driver's door. I don't know exactly how long I sat there before I started counting. I began counting at what I estimated was around the 5-minute mark, counting my own breaths, which is something I do when I'm trying to stay calm without fully acknowledging that I need to. By the time I reached 20 minutes, my coffee was cold, and my back had gone stiff from the way I was holding myself, rigid, pressed back against my seat as if distance from the windshield would help somehow. The door never opened. That was the thing that kept rearranging itself in my head. Even in those first minutes sitting there, no one had gotten out. No dome light had flickered on when I pulled in the brief interior flash that happens when a door opens. No shadow had moved inside the cab. Whoever was behind that wheel, if anyone was, had simply stopped and gone still. I thought about getting out. I thought about walking over there and knocking on the window the way you'd check on someone who might be in medical distress. I thought about that for a while. And then I thought about what I'd find if I did that and couldn't talk myself into moving. Around the 22-minute mark, a family came out of the concrete restroom, building a man, a woman, 2 kids in pajamas, barely awake on their feet. They walked to a minivan near the far end of the lot, strapped the kids in, and drove away. I watched their taillights curve up the ramp and disappear onto the highway. The lot went quiet again. I made a decision. I started my car, backed out of my space, and drove toward the exit ramp without looking back. I am not proud of how much effort that last part took, not looking back. I kept my eyes on the ramp, on the highway, on the road ahead, and I pressed the accelerator, and I didn't slow down for a long time. But I did look in the mirror. I couldn't stop myself. When I got back up to speed on the highway, I looked in the mirror expecting to see the rest stop falling away behind me. Just the glow of the fluorescent canopy and the dark lot and the dark truck sitting in it. The headlights were already there. Same distance, same amber glow, already behind me as if no time had passed at all, as if it had never stopped. I drove the rest of the way home without stopping. I drove at 70 miles an hour on roads that suggested 55, and I didn't touch the radio, and I didn't drink the cold coffee, and I didn't take my eyes off the mirror for more than a few seconds at a stretch. The headlights followed me all the way to the county line, that fixed, patient distance maintained without variation for nearly 2 more hours. Then, somewhere in the stretch of road just north of my town, they were gone. I don't know exactly when they disappeared because I'd made the mistake of watching the road instead of the mirror for a minute or two, and when I looked back, the highway behind me was empty and dark. No truck, no amber lights, no sound of an engine when I rolled my window down and listened. I pulled into my own driveway at 10 minutes past 3 and sat there with the car still running for a while. I've made that drive probably 30 times since then. I leave in daylight now, or I don't go at all. I've told myself, in the way you tell yourself things you aren't sure you believe, that it was someone who happened to be traveling the same route, someone who stopped when I stopped out of their own coincidental fatigue, someone whose schedule aligned with mine well enough to explain everything I saw. But I know what 40 minutes of identical spacing feels like. I know what it means when someone pulls into a lot with 10 open spaces and parks 2 away from you. I know what the inside of a vehicle looks like when someone gets out the light, the movement, the small human signs of a person existing in a space. There were none of those things. There was only the truck, the silence, and the 22 minutes I spent waiting for a door that never opened. And somewhere out on that dark stretch of Georgia highway, there is probably still whatever was behind that wheel, patient, unhurried, content to follow at a fixed and careful distance through the long, pine-walled dark. The festival had been Delia's idea, the way most things that cost me sleep are Delia's ideas. 3 days in the hill country outside of Cookville, 2 stages, local bands mostly, the kind of event that draws a few thousand people and feels enormous while you're inside it and small and far away the moment you leave. We'd shared a tent on a slope of trampled grass and spent 2 nights not sleeping well and 2 days drinking warm beer in the sun, and by the time Sunday evening came around and the last act finished and the crowd began its slow dispersion toward the parking fields, we were both the particular kind of exhausted that settles into your bones and makes everything feel slightly unreal. Delia had wanted to find a motel and drive back in the morning. I'd been the one who said, "No, let's just go. It's only 4 hours, I can drive it." I've thought about that decision many times since. We loaded the car in the early dark, around 9, and joined the long procession of headlights winding down off the festival grounds onto the county road. By the time we cleared the traffic and got onto the state route heading south, it was closer to 10. Delia kicked her seat back, pulled her jacket over her shoulders like a blanket, and was asleep within 20 minutes. I had the radio finding and losing stations through the Tennessee hills, and a gas station coffee in the cup holder that I'd bought at a Flying J outside of Manchester, and that was already going cold in the way gas station coffee always does, faster than seems physically reasonable. I wasn't tired, exactly. I was in that hollow, buzzing state that comes after too much noise and sun and not enough sleep alert in a thin, unreliable way. The way you're alert at the end of a long fever. My eyes were working. My hands were on the wheel, but some deeper part of me had already started to power down. And I think that's important to understand about what happened next, that I was in a state where my instincts were faster than my thoughts, where my body could respond to something before my mind had finished deciding what it was. We crossed into Alabama somewhere around 11. The state route became a county road, 2 lanes, no median. The kind of road that feels like it was laid down according to property lines, rather than any logic of travel. Northern Alabama, up in that corner of the state, is hill country, not the dramatic ridgelines of Appalachia proper, but a soft, rolling terrain of second-growth hardwood and old pasture and creek hollows that the trees have been slowly reclaiming for decades. In the dark, with no moon worth mentioning, the tree lines on either side of the road were simply walls of black, and the road existed as a narrow corridor between them, lit only as far as my headlights reached, and no farther. The mile markers came and went. I'd been counting them without meaning to the way your mind latches onto repetitive things when you're tired and trying to stay present. I remember 8. I remember thinking about nothing in particular, just watching the road, just covering ground. Then I was past 9, and something was crossing the road ahead of me. My foot hit the brake before I'd consciously seen it. That's not a figure of speech or a reconstruction. The brake came first, the seeing came after, which tells you something about how fast it moved and how immediately wrong it registered to whatever part of the brain runs faster than language. The tires didn't squeal. I wasn't going fast enough for that, but the car lurched forward with the deceleration, and Delia's head came off the window, and she said, sharp and sudden, the way people speak when they're yanked out of sleep, "What? What happened?" I didn't answer her right away. I was stopped in the middle of the road, hazard lights not on, engine idling, headlights cutting across an empty stretch of pavement. Nothing was in the road. Whatever had crossed was already gone into the tree line on the right, the trees pressing close there. No shoulder to speak of, just the asphalt edge, and then the dark between the trunks. I stared at the point where I'd last registered movement, the place where the road met the tree line, and there was nothing there. Just bark and shadow and the flat, reflective nothing of a dark Alabama forest at midnight. "Hey," Delia's voice had gone from startled to careful. "What is it?" I told her I'd almost hit a deer. The words came out steadily, which surprised me, because my hands were shaking faintly on the wheel in a way I was hoping she couldn't see in the dark. She made a sound relief, mostly, with a note of residual alarm, and resettled herself against the door, pulling her jacket back up. Within a few minutes, her breathing had evened out again. I sat with what I'd seen and tried to make it into a deer. The problem was the height. I've come close to deer on night roads before everyone who drives rural roads in the South has, and I know what a deer looks like. Mid-crossing, lit by headlights, that moment of caught stillness or panicked sprint. A big buck, fully grown, stands maybe 4.5 feet at the shoulder. What I'd seen had been taller than that, not by a little. Taller in the way a person is taller than a deer, a vertical tallness, an upright tallness, not the horizontal span of a large animal's body. And the movement had been wrong. I kept returning to the movement. A deer in a sprint is a fluid thing, all arching spine and reaching legs. A kind of liquid urgency that looks, even when it's frightened, almost graceful. What I'd seen had not been graceful. It had been fast. But the speed had seemed effortful in a way animal speed never does. Rigid through the center of the body, through what I can only call the torso. The arms, and I am telling you, I registered them as arms, not legs, not haunches, but arms held out slightly from the sides, not pumping, not reaching, just held, the way a person holds their arms when they're moving quickly and trying not to fall. I pulled back onto the road and drove. I didn't tell Delia what I actually thought I'd seen. I wasn't sure I could say it out loud without it sounding like the kind of thing you say when you've had too much sun and too little sleep, and part of me was already engaged in the necessary work of finding an alternative explanation. Something on two legs could be a person jogging, a person crossing the road. People do strange things at strange hours in rural places, and a person running across a county road at midnight in northern Alabama is a more comfortable explanation than the thing I was afraid of, which was that there was no explanation, which was that what I'd seen didn't fit into any category I had language for. But a person running crosses a road the way a person runs, with the recognizable asymmetry of the human gait, the give in the knees, the swing of the arms and counterbalance. What I'd seen hadn't moved like that. It had moved like something that understood the principle of bipedal locomotion without having been built for it. Like something that had learned to run upright the way you learn a skill later in life, technically correct in its broad strokes and subtly, deeply wrong in all the small ones. The road unspooled ahead of me. I kept both hands on the wheel. I set the coffee down sometime in the next hour and didn't pick it up again. I couldn't have said exactly why, except that the idea of looking away from the road, even for the 2 seconds it took to raise a cup to my mouth, felt suddenly and specifically dangerous. I needed to see what was ahead of me. I needed to see the edges of the road where the tree lines were, the thin margin of visibility my headlights gave me, and I needed not to look away from it for any reason. Delia slept. I drove through Gunnersville without stopping, even though I'd planned to stop for gas, because stopping meant sitting still in the dark, and I found I didn't want to do that. The gauge read a quarter tank, enough to get home. I kept moving. There were no more mile markers that I paid attention to. There were no more sounds from the trees that I let myself really hear, because the road had developed a sound of its own, the roadside brush moving in the passage of my car, the way branches extended close to the pavement on the curves, and I had started interpreting everything in it as movement, as presence, as something keeping pace with me just inside the tree line, which I knew was my frightened brain constructing patterns and I could not fully stop it from doing. We got home a little past 2 in the morning. I woke Delia in the driveway, and she went inside without asking why I was sitting in the car with the engine still running. I sat there for another 10 minutes before I went in. I've looked up the road since then, on satellite maps, on state road databases. Mile marker 9 on that county route sits adjacent to a stretch of land that used to be a farm. The infrastructure has been reclaimed by trees for decades, but you can still see the old fence lines in the satellite view, the ghost of pasture beneath the canopy. There's nothing there, no structure, no access road, no reason for anyone to be moving through that particular stretch of tree line at midnight. I still drive at night. I still take back roads, because you have to, because that's how you get between places in the rural South, and I'm not going to stop living the life I live because of one moment on one road in northern Alabama. But I keep my eyes on the tree lines now, not because I think I'll see it again, more because I understand something I didn't understand before, that what my headlights illuminate is a very small circle of known space, and that on either side of it the dark goes on much longer than I used to think, and that I cannot account for everything moving through it. I never told Delia. I don't know that I ever will. Some nights I wonder if she actually fell back asleep as quickly as I thought, or if she lay there against the window with her eyes closed and her breathing measured, listening to the silence I was keeping, understanding that whatever I'd seen I wasn't ready to name. Whatever it was, it made it across the road. It went into the dark on the other side and kept going, wherever it was going, at that strange, stiff-armed, urgent run. I don't know what it wanted with the other side. I don't know what it was coming from. I just know it knew how to move, and that it was in no particular hurry once it was past me, and that I have never fully trusted a tree line at night again. Priya and I had been driving since just after sundown, which had been her preference, and mine. Both we'd learned over several years together that we travel better at night, that the hours compress differently when there's nothing to see outside the windows, that the miles go faster when you're not watching them. We were heading to her aunt's place outside of Hattiesburg, a trip we made 2 or 3 times a year, and we had it down to a kind of ritual by then. She handled the first leg. I took over somewhere around the state line. We stopped once for gas and bad coffee, and kept moving. It was comfortable. It was familiar. It was the kind of drive where you stop really thinking about the fact that you're driving, and just exist inside the motion of it. We were maybe 90 miles south of Memphis when I caught her in the headlights. I want to be careful about how I describe what I saw, because in the years since then I've turned it over so many times that I'm afraid some of the details have softened or sharpened in ways I can't account for. What I know for certain is this. She was standing at the very edge of the road shoulder, right where the asphalt crumbles into gravel and then grass, and she was waving with both arms raised above her head. Not the frantic, desperate wave of someone in trouble, not the full-body urgency of a person trying to stop a car before it passes. It was slow, almost ceremonial, both arms moving together in a wide, even arc, the way you'd wave at someone you recognized from across a distance, the way you'd signal to a friend. I braked before I'd consciously decided to. The car rolled to a stop on the shoulder, maybe 30 yards past her, and I put it in park, and Priya said, quietly, and with a firmness that I recognized as the particular tone she uses when she wants me to understand she is serious, "Don't." I told her someone was stranded. I told her I couldn't just drive past a girl alone on a highway at 2 in the morning. Priya looked at me in the way she sometimes does, the way that means she has already thought further ahead than I have. And then she looked out at the girl approaching in the side mirror and said, "Something's wrong with her." I didn't ask what she meant. I got out of the car. The girl was already walking toward me, covering the distance between us at an even pace, not hurrying, not relieved. She was young. I put her somewhere between 16 and 19, though something about her face made it difficult to settle on a number. She was wearing a white sundress, or it had been white once it had gone, the gray beige of something washed too many times or worn too long without washing. Road dust worked into the fabric. Her feet were bare on the asphalt, which I noticed immediately, and which sent a small cold signal through me that I chose to ignore. No shoes, no bag over her shoulder, no phone in her hand. People broken down on highways have phones. Everyone has a phone. I asked if she was okay. She said she was fine. The word came out flat, without the inflection of someone who has been frightened or relieved or rescued. Just a statement of condition, delivered without affect. She told me her car had broken down about a mile back. She said she just needed a ride to the next town. The voice was steady and even, and pitched slightly lower than I'd expected from someone her size. She wasn't shaking, she wasn't crying. Her eyes were dry, and her breathing was calm, and her hands were loose at her sides. And I stood there on the shoulder of a Mississippi state highway at 2 in the morning trying to reconcile the person in front of me with the circumstances she was claiming. If your car breaks down alone at night and you walk a mile in bare feet on asphalt and you flag down the first car you see, you are not calm. That's not a judgment, it's just physiology. Adrenaline does specific things to the human body, and the absence of those things, in that situation, means something that I didn't let myself think about clearly enough. I said we could give her a ride, and I opened the rear door, and she got in and sat directly behind my seat. I got back in the front, closed my door, and looked at Priya, who was looking straight ahead through the windshield with her hands folded in her lap and her jaw set. I pulled back onto the highway. After a moment, I asked the girl the name of the town she needed to get to. She said a name. I won't try to reproduce it exactly because I've gone back and forth about whether I heard it correctly, but it was 2 words, the kind of small-town name that's common in that part of Mississippi, the kind that combines a family name with a geographic suffix. I nodded like I knew it, and waited until I'd driven far enough that the question wouldn't seem suspicious, and then I typed it into my phone's Maps application with the phone sitting flat on my thigh. No results. I expanded the search radius. Nothing within 40 miles. I tried alternate spellings, 2 different ways to render what I'd heard. Still, nothing. I set the phone down and thought about how to raise it, and said, after a moment, that I was having trouble finding it, that maybe I was spelling it wrong. Could she tell me again? Silence from the back seat. Priya shifted almost imperceptibly in the passenger seat, a micro-movement that I recognized as her registering the non-answer. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The girl was looking out the window. Her hands were folded in her lap, very still, fingers laced, and she was smiling. Not at me, not at her own reflection in the glass, at something outside, something in the dark cotton fields passing at 60 miles an hour, something that was apparently there, in the specific dark beyond the glass, that warranted this soft and private smile, like she was watching something she'd been waiting to see, like the dark outside was showing her something it wasn't showing us. I asked again about the town name. My voice came out level, which required something from me. She said, without turning from the window, that we'd know when we got there. Priya's hand found my knee in the dark between the seats. She pressed once, firmly. I understood the message. I understood it, and I was in complete agreement with it. And I was also doing 60 on a 2-lane highway with no shoulder to speak of, and a girl in my back seat, whose feet had been bare on hot asphalt, and who was smiling at things in the dark that I couldn't see, and I needed to think carefully about the next 30 seconds. I said we actually needed to stop for gas soon, and I was going to pull off at the next station. This was a lie. The tank was more than half full. The girl said nothing. The next several miles were the longest I have driven. Priya sat perfectly still beside me. I kept my eyes moving between the road and the mirror. The road, the mirror, the road. And in the mirror, the girl sat the way she'd been sitting since she got in, hands folded, face turned to the window, that expression on her profile that I couldn't fully see from the angle I had, but that I could tell hadn't changed. Every so often, the darkness outside shifted a gap in the tree line, a farm light far back in a field, and I watched for a reaction from her, some indication of what she was tracking with that steady, private attention. I couldn't find it. A gas station appeared on the right. One of the old stand-alone kind, a single canopy over 2 pumps, a cinder block building behind it. I pulled in too fast, the tires grabbing on the sudden transition from asphalt to concrete, and stopped under the canopy in the full fluorescent light. The light was enormous after the dark of the highway. I put the car in park and turned around. I don't know what I expected. I don't know exactly what I was bracing for. She was sitting in the same position, hands folded, but she'd turned from the window and was looking at me directly for the first time since she'd gotten in, and her face in the gas station light was very young and very still, and the smile was gone. She looked at me the way you look at someone when you're deciding something about them, when you're measuring something. Her eyes were dark, and the fluorescent light was doing something to them I couldn't account for. A depth to them, a quality of attention that didn't fit the face. I said, and I remember exactly what I said because I've repeated it to myself 100 times since I said that this was as far as we could take her, that we were actually turning off here, that I was sorry we couldn't get her closer to where she was going. She looked at me for another moment. Then she unlocked the door and got out. She didn't say anything. She didn't thank us. She pushed the door closed without slamming it and walked to the edge of the gas station's light and stood there at that precise border between the fluorescence and the dark and looked back at the car. I pulled out of the station and got back on the highway without letting myself watch her in the mirror for too long. Priya didn't say anything for several miles. Then she said, "Her feet." I said, "I know." She said, "There wasn't any blood." I said, "I know." She said, "She walked a mile on asphalt in bare feet in the summer, and there wasn't any blood." Neither of us said anything else for a long time. I've thought about the town name more than anything else. I've tried every spelling I can construct from what I heard. I've looked through historical records, through old county maps, through the kinds of local history databases that list places that were settled and abandoned and absorbed by larger municipalities over the course of a century. There's nothing. There is no record of a town by that name in that county or the 2 counties adjacent to it. Whatever place she was going, it doesn't appear on any map I've been able to find, which either means I heard wrong or it means something I don't have a category for. What I keep returning to, the thing that has not softened with time the way most unsettling memories eventually do, is the smile. Not the circumstances, not the bare feet, not the town that doesn't exist. The smile she had for whatever she was watching in the dark outside that window. The quality of it, the privacy of it, like we were incidental to her evening. Like the inside of our car was just a place she was passing through on her way to somewhere she'd already been looking forward to. Like the dark outside knew her name and had something waiting for her, and she was simply glad to be going back. I want to start by saying that I am not the kind of person who spooks easily on the road. I've done long solo drives since I was 22, cross-country twice, regional hauls more times than I can count. And I have a particular relationship with highway solitude that most people don't understand unless they've experienced it themselves. The road at night is its own country. It has its own logic. I know how fatigue distorts things, how the brain in its desperation for pattern will manufacture significance out of nothing, how a dark highway at 2 in the morning can turn an ordinary roadside figure into something that follows you home in your thoughts. I know all of that. I want you to understand that I know all of that before I tell you what happened. I left Knoxville on a Tuesday in the middle of July, heading south toward Birmingham for work. The drive was one I'd done maybe 4 or 5 times before, familiar enough that I had a loose itinerary in my head where I'd stop for gas, roughly where I'd eat if I was hungry, which stretches of interstate I preferred to the alternatives. I left around 9 in the evening because I'd had meetings all day and hadn't been able to get away sooner, and because I'd rather drive late and arrive at a reasonable hour than leave at dawn and spend the day behind the wheel. I stopped for gas outside of Chattanooga at a station just off the interstate, one of the large chain ones with a canopy over 8 or 10 pumps and a convenience store attached. It was a Tuesday night. T in the lot was quiet, a few other cars at the pumps. A semi pulled around back. I got out, ran my card, started filling the tank, and that's when I noticed him. He was standing near the air pump station at the far end of the lot, the kind of stand-alone unit on a pole with the coiled hose and the pressure gauge. There was no car near it, no bicycle, no reason, that I could see, for a person to be standing there. He was tall and thin, and he was wearing a canvas jacket, the kind with the corduroy collar, olive or khaki colored, the kind you see at farm supply stores, which struck me because it was the middle of July, and the temperature was still in the low 80s, even at that hour. He was facing the lot, not moving, not looking at his phone, just standing with his hands at his sides, watching. I did what you do. I noted him, and let my attention move on. I finished pumping, went inside, bought a sandwich. I ate standing at my car because I didn't want to sit in the lot longer than necessary, got back in, and pulled out. In the few seconds between opening my car door and closing it, I looked toward the air pump. He was still there, same position, hands at his sides. I drove south and didn't think about him again for almost 2 hours. The rest area in northern Georgia sat a few miles past the state line, a small facility with a concrete building housing restrooms and vending machines, a covered picnic area, and a row of parking spaces along a landscaped median. I pulled in around midnight, stiff from sitting, needing to move. I used the restroom, read the informational placard about Georgia state parks that I've read 4 times now on this same route, bought something from the vending machine, and walked back out to the parking lot. He was standing at the far edge of the lot, where the pavement met the tree line. I stopped walking. The brain does its work fast, and its first work is always denial. It presented me immediately with the case for coincidence. Same general build, maybe. A canvas jacket is not an unusual garment. Rest areas on this corridor draw from the same pool of travelers. The distance between Chattanooga and the state line is 2 hours, and anyone who left that gas station when I did could have made the same drive. I stood there and let my brain make its argument, and I listened to it, and I looked at the man at the edge of the tree line, and I noted the particular stillness of him, the way he was standing with his hands at his sides, and his face oriented toward the parking lot, toward where I was standing, and the argument began to lose some of its force. He wasn't looking at me specifically. That's what I told myself. He was facing the lot the way people face things, when they're thinking about something else, unfocused, present in body, but elsewhere in mind. The parking lot was where the light was. People orient toward light. It meant nothing. I got in my car. I sat for a moment before starting the engine, and I watched him in the side mirror. He didn't move toward the lot, didn't move toward me, just stood at that border between the asphalt and the trees, hands down, face forward, utterly, completely still. I drove. I want to be honest about the state I was in by this point. I was unsettled in the way that you're unsettled by something you've decided not to take seriously, which is its own specific kind of discomfort, a low-grade alertness, a background hum of something unresolved that you're managing by not looking at it directly. I turned the radio up. I drank water. I focused on the road and the mile markers and the ordinary passage of an ordinary night drive, and I told myself I was tired and connecting things that weren't connected. The diner outside of Dalton appeared on the right about 40 minutes later. I hadn't planned to stop there. It was earlier than I usually eat on this route, but I was hungry, and the sandwich from the gas station hadn't been enough, and the lights of the place looked warm and real. After the long dark stretch of highway, and I told myself that a cup of coffee and something hot would settle me, and I'd feel better for the rest of the drive. I pulled into the gravel lot. The crunch of it under my tires was loud in the quiet. I put the car in park. I opened my door and stepped out, and he was sitting on the hood of a car, 2 spaces to my left. He was already looking at me when I registered him. Not turning toward me, already looking, as if he'd been watching the spot where my car would pull in and waiting for me to emerge from it. The canvas jacket. His height, even when seated, legs long, feet flat on the gravel. In the light coming from the diner windows, I could see his face for the first time with any clarity, and it was a long face, angular, with deep-set eyes that held the light in a way that gave them a quality of particular intensity. He wasn't startled by my appearance. He wasn't curious about me the way you're curious about a stranger. He watched me get out of my car with the calm attentiveness of someone watching something they've been anticipating, and he didn't look away when I noticed him, and he didn't nod or speak or make any adjustment to his expression at all. I went inside. I took a stool at the counter because I wanted the counter between me and the room, wanted the wall at my back. A woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head brought me a menu, and you and I ordered coffee, eggs, and toast. And then I sat there, and I did not touch the coffee, and I tried to work through it clearly and logically. 3 stops. He had been at 3 stops. The gas station outside of Chattanooga, the rest area in Georgia, and now this diner in Dalton. 3 points on my specific route, in sequence, spaced across nearly 3 hours of driving. I had not seen him on the highway between stops. I had not seen a vehicle associated with him at any location. He had arrived at this diner, the data said. Before me, he was already seated on that hood when I pulled in, which meant he had arrived with enough lead time to be settled and still, not stepping out of a car when I arrived, not walking across the lot. Already there. I thought about whether there was a parallel route, whether someone who knew this corridor well enough could move between these points faster than I could on the interstate. There are state routes that cut more directly between some of these locations, roads that bypass the curves of the highway, that go as the crow flies rather than as the road bends. Someone who knew them well, someone local to this corridor, could theoretically beat a highway driver between certain points. I turned this over. It was possible, technically. It required that this person had known in advance which of the many gas stations I'd choose, which of the rest areas, and which diner. It required a knowledge of my itinerary that I hadn't shared with anyone. My food came, and I cut it into pieces and didn't eat it. After about 20 minutes, I asked the waitress, as casually as I could manage, whether she recognized the man in the canvas jacket in the lot. I described him briefly. She went to the window, looked out, and came back and said she didn't see anyone in the lot. I asked if he'd come inside tonight. She said not that she'd noticed, but it had been busy earlier. I paid for the meal I hadn't eaten, left a tip that was probably too large because I wasn't thinking clearly about money, and walked back outside. The car he'd been sitting in was still there. He wasn't. I stood in the gravel lot and turned a slow, full circle and looked at the edges of the lot, the road, the darkness between the parked cars. Nothing, no movement, no tall, thin figure in a canvas jacket at the periphery of anything. I was alone in the lot with the crunch of gravel under my shoes and the hum of the diner behind me and the Georgia night pressing in warm and close from all sides. I drove the rest of the way to Birmingham without stopping. Every gas station I passed, I looked. Every rest area, every lit parking lot is visible from the highway. I looked at each one the way you look at something when you're hoping not to see a particular thing in it. That specific fearful attention that makes the not seeing almost worse than the seeing, because at least the seeing would mean you understood the shape of what you were dealing with. I got to the hotel at 3:30 and parked in the attached garage under full fluorescent light and sat in the car for a long moment before getting out. I've never been able to explain it in terms that satisfy me. I've tried the parallel route theory, the coincidence theory, and the fatigue and pattern recognition theory. I've sat with each of them and found the place where they break down. What I keep returning to is the moment in the diner lot when I stepped out of my car and found him already looking at me, already waiting, and the specific quality of that waiting patient, certain, without any of the qualities of surprise or curiosity that would tell me he was seeing me for the first time. He looked at me the way you look at someone whose arrival you've scheduled, someone you've been expecting, someone whose route you know so well that you can be at the next stop before they are and be rested by the time they arrive. I've made that drive twice since then, both times in daylight, both times with someone else in the car. I don't think I'll do it alone again at night. I don't have a clear reason I can defend to anyone who wasn't there. But I think about the stillness of him at each location, that complete, unhurried stillness. And I think about how many more stops there would have been if I'd kept stopping. And I think the answer to that is one I don't want to know badly enough to test it. The mountain roads of western North Carolina do something to a person driving alone at night that I don't think I can fully describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. It isn't fear exactly, or not fear in the acute sense. It's something more like submersion. The roads curve through the hollows and up the ridges in a way that takes your headlights and throws them into tree walls and rock faces, and the occasional guardrail painted orange with rust. And there's a quality of enclosure to it that makes you feel less like you're traveling through a landscape and more like the landscape is folding itself around you. The sky disappears. The road ahead is whatever your lights decide it is. Everything else is the mountain, and the mountain doesn't particularly care that you're there. I'd been driving since just after 8 that evening, coming up from Spartanburg through the Cherokee foothills and into the higher elevations of the Blue Ridge. I was heading to a property my family owns in a small community outside of Silva, a place we use in the summers, an old farmhouse that my grandmother lived in until she couldn't anymore, and that we've kept without quite being able to let go of. I make the drive up a few times a year, usually to check on things, make sure the pipes are intact, deal with whatever the winter or the summer has done to the roof or the porch or the stone wall along the upper pasture. It's not a difficult trip. I know the roads. I'd done it alone a dozen times. The radio had been unreliable since I left the South Carolina Piedmont behind and started climbing. That's normal. Up in those mountains, the signals from the Charlotte stations fade somewhere around Chimney, Rock, K, and after that, you're searching, finding fragments, losing them around curves. I'd been cycling through static and half-caught gospel and a weather band loop that repeated the same outdated forecast every 4 minutes, and I'd largely given up and been driving in silence, which up in those hollows is not quite silence. There's always the engine, the road noise, the occasional sound of a creek running close to the road that comes in through the cracked window and then fades. But silence enough that when a station finally locked in clean and strong sometime after midnight, I reached for the volume before I'd even registered what I was hearing. Classic country, old stuff, Hank Williams or someone in that lineage. The kind of music that sounds like it was recorded in a room with bare wooden walls. I turned it up and let it fill the car and felt the specific relief of a sound that meant company. I drove for another 2 hours like that. The music held, which surprised me. Usually by the time you get deep into the plot balsams, the signals drop entirely, but it stayed strong and clear, and I let myself relax into it, let the miles go, watched the road and the tree walls, and the occasional reflective post at the edge of a curve, and let the music be enough to keep me present. Then, a few minutes before 3 in the morning, the music cut. Not faded, not broke up into static the way a signal does when you lose it. Cut, clean and immediate, mid-note, as if something upstream had simply closed a valve. And in the silence that followed, before I'd even had time to reach for the dial, the tone came through. Anyone who has heard the emergency alert system tone knows that it lives in a particular register of the nervous system that bypasses conscious thought entirely. It is not a pleasant sound. It is engineered not to be a pleasant sound. It is a sustained, multi-frequency drone designed to penetrate sleep and inattention. And even when you know what it is, even when your rational mind is labeling it correctly, There is something in the body that responds to it with a spike of something ancient and unhappy. I reached for the volume and turned it down before I realized the tone wasn't actually loud, it was just the tone being what it is. The voice followed, automated, obviously synthesized, reading in that cadence that is almost, but not quite human. The syllables correctly stressed, but the rhythm slightly too. Even the pauses between phrases identical in length, the way no human speaking ever quite is. I've heard these broadcasts before. Road closures, weather alerts, amber alerts. I settled into listening the way you settle into listening to something you expect to be routine and applicable to someone else. It is named Haywood County. That was my county. But Haywood County has something like 40,000 residents and is a reasonable-sized piece of mountain territory. So I didn't register it as particular. Then it named the highway, not the route number, the name. County Road 7 is what people in that part of the county call a certain road that runs along the Upper Creek drainage past a cluster of old homesteads and hunting properties. It is not its official designation. Its official designation is a state road number that nobody uses. County Road 7 is what it is called by locals, by people who have lived in those hills long enough to know the roads by their given names rather than their bureaucratic ones. It does not appear that way on maps. It does not appear that way on GPS applications. If you ask someone to navigate to County Road 7, the maps would give you nothing. The broadcast said that name, County Road 7. I was on County Road 7. I remember the exact sensation of that moment, a kind of cold clarity, the way things sometimes get very precise right at the edge of something frightening. I heard the name E, and something in me went still, and I let my foot come off the accelerator, R, and the car slowed without my braking while I listened. The broadcast described a missing person, last seen on foot in the area of County Road 7, in the creek drainage below the upper ridge. Last seen approximately 45 minutes prior. The area described was the stretch of road I had passed through roughly 20 minutes before I could place it, because of a particular bend where the road drops toward a low-water bridge and the trees part briefly enough to see. The ridgeline above, a landmark I always notice on this drive. I remember thinking, someone is lost in those woods. I remember the specific sorrow of that, imagining a person out there, in the mountain dark, in the creek drainage, the temperature dropping the way it does up in those hollows, even in summer. I remember thinking that I should try to call someone, and then remembering I had no signal. The broadcast began with a description of the missing person. The language these things use is standardized. Height, weight, or build, last known clothing. They read through it in the same automated cadence, those identical pauses between phrases, and I listened, and in the several seconds before my brain assembled what my ears were receiving into meaning, I heard the voice describe someone approximately my height, described as slender build, last seen wearing. And here is where my hands tightened on the wheel. A gray long-sleeve shirt and dark pants, carrying no visible bag, traveling northbound on County Road 7. I was wearing a gray long-sleeve shirt. I was wearing dark pants. I had no bag in the passenger seat, only a jacket on the floor. I was traveling northbound on County Road 7. The broadcast described my car. The color, which is an unusual color, a pale green that people sometimes call sage, and the make, and the model year, within a range of 2 years. I have never seen another car this specific color on this road. I have never seen another car this color in this county. The broadcast ended with a number to call, and the music came back, mid-song, as if whatever had cut it had simply reopened. I drove for another quarter mile on pure momentum before I realized I wasn't steering with any intention, and I pulled onto the shoulder, put the car in park, and turned my hazards on. The orange light pulsed out and came back, out and came back, lighting the trees on either side in rhythmic flashes. I sat with the engine running and the music playing at a volume that now seemed absurd. Dee and I tried to construct an explanation for what I'd just heard. I considered that I'd misheard, that my brain, in its fatigue, had bent the description toward self-recognition, the way tired minds bend things, that what the broadcast had actually described was generic enough that I'd filled it in with myself. I held this theory and examined it seriously. I am trained by years of long drives to be suspicious of my own perception after midnight. It was possible. It was the most comfortable possibility. But the road name sat in the middle of that theory like a stone, and I could not get around it. County Road 7. No map calls it that. No navigation system. No official document. Whatever had composed that broadcast had known the local name for this road, and I did not know how a machine-generated emergency broadcast could know something that existed only in the spoken tradition of the people who lived in these hills. I sat with my hazards on and watched the road behind me in my mirrors. It was empty. The mountain dark as thorough, no ambient light from towns, no glow from distant highways. Just the double yellow of my hazards on the asphalt and the trees, and beyond the trees. The ridge I couldn't see but knew was there. I tried my phone. No signal, not one bar. I drove until I got to a high point on the road where I sometimes get intermittent coverage, and stopped again and tried there. Nothing. I thought about the number the broadcast had given to call and understood that I could not call it even if I'd wanted to. I drove the rest of the way to the farmhouse without stopping, let myself in, locked both locks, and sat at the kitchen table until the sun came up over the ridge and the birds started in the meadow below the porch. In the morning, I called the county sheriff's office from the landline at the house and described what I'd heard. The dispatcher was polite. She told me there had been no emergency broadcast issued for Haywood County the previous night. No missing persons call. No alert of any kind on that frequency. I asked about County Road 7. She asked me to repeat it. I did. She said she wasn't familiar with that designation. Said I'd have to give her the state road number if I wanted her to look something up. I've thought about it from every angle I can reach. I've thought about pirate broadcasts, about equipment malfunctions, about the specific acoustics of mountain hollows, and how they sometimes do strange things with signals. I've thought about the possibility that I constructed the whole thing out of fatigue and static and a mind looking for patterns in the noise. What I can't think my way around is the color of my car. Sage green, the broadcast said it. Sage green, the year range, and the make. The kind of detail that would require whoever composed that broadcast to have seen my car, to have been close enough to read it accurately in the dark, to have known the road's local name and my clothing and my direction of travel, and submitted all of it to whatever system produced that voice, and those calibrated to even pauses. I don't drive County Road 7 at night anymore. I tell myself it's just a preference, that I've gotten older and more cautious, that mountain roads are genuinely more dangerous in the dark. All of that is true. None of it is the reason. The reason is that somewhere out there is whoever saw me, whoever watched my sage green car pass through that hollow and knew enough about me to fill in a report, and I have never been able to determine whether the broadcast was meant as a warning or something else entirely. My brother Marcus is 7 years older than me, which meant that by the time I was old enough to drive, he had already accumulated a particular kind of road knowledge, the kind that comes from years of working jobs that require you to move between places at hours when most people are asleep. He drove freight routes for a while in his early 20s, then did long-haul consulting work across the rural South, and somewhere in all of that accumulation of night miles, he developed a set of rules that he passed down to me the way older siblings pass things down, casually and without much ceremony, as if they were obvious. Don't stop for people flagging you down on unlit roads unless you can see a clear emergency. Don't pull over to the shoulder in wooded areas to check your phone. Don't stop for flares. He told me the flares rule specifically when I was maybe 19, the summer I got my first car with enough range to make long trips. We were sitting on his porch, and he was talking the way he talks when he's decided to tell you something important but doesn't want it to seem like a lecture sideways, almost casual, like he was thinking out loud. He said that in certain parts of the rural South, flares laid out on a road at night without any visible emergency attached to them were not an accident. He said some people use them the way hunters use calls, to bring things to a stop. I asked him what he meant by some people, and he gave me a look that meant he wasn't going to specify and said, just don't stow. If you see them without a cop car or a wreck, you don't stop, you go around, or you turn around and find another way. And that's it. I laughed. I was 19, and the world was still a place that organized itself according to reasonable principles. And the idea that someone would lay flares across a Mississippi back road to stop passing cars seemed like the kind of thing that happened in movies, and not to people like me on roads like those. He didn't argue. Just let the subject go and change it to something else. the way he does when he's said what he needs to say. I thought about that conversation on a Tuesday night in late July, driving south through the Delta on a state route that cuts through some of the flattest land I have ever seen. I was coming back from visiting a college friend who'd moved to Clarksdale, heading toward Jackson, and I'd taken the back route because the friend who lived there had told me the state route was faster than the highway at that hour, and he'd been right. I'd barely seen another car since I left his place around 11. The land out there is agricultural flatland, cotton and soybean fields, stretching out on both sides to a horizon that even in the dark you can feel more than see, that enormous flat openness that has no equivalent in the hill country where I grew up. Your headlights reach out farther there than they do anywhere else I've driven. You can see a long way ahead of you, which should feel safer than mountain roads and somehow doesn't. All that visibility, and there's still something about the Delta at midnight that sits wrong in the chest. I had the windows up and the air conditioning running because July in Mississippi is a specific kind of assault, and I wasn't interested in participating in it. The radio was finding stations intermittently out there between the small towns. The signals go thin. I'd settled on a news station out of Memphis that was doing a midnight call-in program, people phoning in about local issues. The specific rhythm of ordinary grievances and small community concerns that is about as grounding a thing as I can think of to listen to when you're alone on a dark road. The flares appeared after a long curve. The road had bent to the right in the gentle way flat country roads do, not a sharp turn, just a long arc, and when my headlights completed the curve and straightened out, they were there. 6 of them, burning a deep red-orange in the dark, lay in a chevron pattern that pointed toward me, the tip of the V aimed at my approaching car, the 2 arms of it spreading across both lanes. They were burning hot and bright, not the sputtering, half-spent burn of flares that have been down for an hour, but the full, intense burn of something recently lit, the kind of light that makes shadows jump and the asphalt around the base of each flare glisten. My foot came off the accelerator and found the brake before I'd consciously decided anything. The car slowed and stopped maybe 20 feet from the closest flare, close enough that the light of it was moving on my hood. I sat with the engine running and my foot on the brake, and I looked at what I was looking at. No car in the road, on either shoulder, in either ditch. No flashlight moving toward me. No figure in a reflective vest waving me down. No police lights anywhere on the horizon. No sound when I turned the radio off except the idle of my engine and the low push of the air conditioning. The flares had been placed, D, and whoever had placed them had then removed themselves entirely from the visible scene, which was the part that my brain kept returning to because that sequence of events lay the flares, disappear does not belong to any legitimate emergency scenario I am aware of. I thought about Marcus. I thought about his porch and his sideways tone and the word hunters. My foot was still on the brake. The car was in drive. I told myself I was going to look for 30 more seconds. And if nothing presented itself as a clear emergency, I was going to reverse and find another route on my phone. I gave myself those 30 seconds because some part of me was still working against the feeling in my chest, still insisting that there was a reasonable explanation ahead of me that would make this ordinary, that I would feel foolish about this tomorrow. In the last few seconds of those 30, I saw the movement in the ditch. It was on the right side of the road, maybe 40 feet ahead of me, just inside where the shoulder dropped off into the drainage ditch that ran along the edge of the field. The grass was high there. Summer grass in Mississippi grows fast, and the road crews don't always keep pace, and what I saw was a disturbance in that grass. A slow, low movement, not the quick scatter of something small startled by headlights. Something large, shifting its weight, resettling, the way a large animal moves when it's been lying still and is considering whether to stay still or move. My headlights hit the grass at a low angle from that distance. E and I could not make out a shape. I could see the movement, and I could understand from the movement that whatever was causing it had significant mass. The grass was tall, and it was bending not in one place, but across a spread of several feet, the way grass bends around something with a large profile, and then it went still. All at once, the way things go still when they've realized they've been illuminated, when they've calculated whether they've been seen. There are moments in life where the body understands something before the mind is willing to. My right hand had already shifted to the gear selector before I completed any conscious thought, and I was in reverse before I had decided to reverse. and I was moving backward along that flat delta road, with my eyes alternating between the backup camera and the ditch on the right side of the road where the grass was still, where whatever had been moving was now very, very still. I backed around the curve. The flares disappeared from my sightline as the road bent. When I'd backed far enough that I was certain I was out of whatever range of vision the thing in the ditch had, I pulled into a field, approach a gravel turnout where farm equipment enters the field, and got my phone out and found a route. There was a county road that intersected with the state route several miles back, one I'd passed without taking, that connected to a parallel road that would add maybe 30 minutes to my drive. I took it. I drove those 30 minutes with my hands tight on the wheel and the radio off, and my eyes on both shoulders of every road I traveled, and I did not stop again until I was well inside the Jackson City limits, where the streetlights were continuous, and there were other cars around me. I called Marcus the next morning. I told him what had happened, the flares, the pattern, the movement in the ditch. I told him I'd backed up and gone around. There was a pause when I finished, and then he asked if I was okay. His voice had that quality it gets when he's choosing his words, that particular carefulness. I said I was fine. I said I wanted to know what he thought I'd seen. He said that what mattered was that I hadn't stopped. He said that I'd done exactly right. He said it in a tone that had a kind of relief in it that I found more disturbing than anything else about the conversation, because relief implies the alternative was real, implies the concern was legitimate, implies that there was something at the end of that road that he had believed I might have encountered. I asked him again, what did he think was in that ditch? He said there were people in certain parts of the rural South who had been doing this for a long time. He didn't say what they did with the cars that stopped. He said some things you don't need the whole picture of to understand that you want no part of it. He said it was enough to know where the edge of the situation was and to have stayed on the right side of it. I pushed once more. He said, quiet and final, that he was glad I called him. I have driven through the Mississippi Delta twice since that summer, both times in daylight, both times on the interstate. I no longer take the back routes through the flat country at night. Not through any part of the Delta, not through the long agricultural stretches of any state, where the fields press up to the road shoulders, and the grass in the ditches grows high, and the road curves in ways that reveal things only after you're already close to them. Marcus never said I told you so. He's never brought it up again, actually, in the years since, which bothers me sometimes, in quiet moments, more than if he had. Because I know my brother, and I know that when he goes quiet on a thing, it's because the thing is larger than a told you so, because the edges of it are wider and darker than a conversation on a porch could really capture, because whatever he knows about those flares and those roads, he learned in some way that cost him something, and he decided a long time ago that the price of carrying it alone was preferable to passing the full weight of it on. He asked if I was okay. That was all. And I have thought many times, in the years since, about what he was really asking when he asked that, whether he meant my body, my nerves, my sleep, or whether he meant something else. Whether he meant, did you see what was in that ditch? Did you see it clearly? Did you see it clearly enough that you'll carry it the way I carry what I've seen? I didn't. I saw movement and mass and stillness, and that was enough. And I think now that not seeing it clearly may be the best outcome available to me. I think there are things you can look at directly that you don't come back from the same way. And I think Marcus knows what those things are. And I think he is quietly, every day, glad that I backed around the curve before I found out for myself. My Uncle Ray has owned the same Ford F-250 since the early 90s, and it looks every year of its age faded, red paint gone to a kind of dusty rose in places, a long crease along the passenger door, from something that happened before I was born, a bench seat with a crack in the vinyl that he'd covered with electrical tape that had itself cracked and curled at the edges over the years. The engine runs well because Ray is meticulous about that, about the mechanical essentials, but everything else about the truck is exactly as weathered and worn as you'd expect a 3-decade-old working vehicle in South Carolina to be. It smells like motor oil and the faint chemical sweetness of the pine tree air freshener he buys in bulk from the auto parts store and hangs 2 at a time from the rearview mirror, rotating them out when they go pale and scentless, which happens fast in the summer heat. I borrowed it because my car was in the shop and the timing couldn't be adjusted. I committed in Missouri, a family obligation that wasn't optional. and my options were the truck or a last-minute flight I couldn't afford. Ray handed me the keys on a Thursday afternoon with a list of 3 things he wanted me to remember. Don't let the temperature gauge get past the midpoint. The left turn signal requires a firm tap rather than a light one. And the CB radio, under the dash, was set to channel 19, and I should leave it alone because it was his, and he had it calibrated the way he wanted it. I hadn't thought about the CB since he mentioned it. I didn't know how to use one, had never had to learn. And for the first 7 hours of the drive, it sat under the dash in silence. Just another piece of the truck's interior, as unremarkable as the cracked seat or the pine trees swinging from the mirror. I'd been driving since late afternoon, made good time through the upstate and across the Smoky Mountain corridor, and by the time I was in western Tennessee, the night had settled in completely. And I was running on a half tank and a gas station burrito I'd eaten somewhere past Nashville, and whatever alertness, the darkness, and the motion of the road could sustain in me. 40 inches, western Tennessee, is not a difficult road. It is flat and straight in the way that interstate highways through agricultural lowlands always are, the kind of driving that requires so little navigation that it starts to ask questions of your attention, whether it's really needed, whether the car couldn't find its way without you, whether you might close your eyes for just a moment. I was managing it with the windows cracked, despite the heat, with the radio loud enough to require some attention to follow, with periodic adjustments to my speed and position that I was making deliberately to keep my hands and mind involved. I knew I was tired. I was managing the tired rather than defeating it, which is all you can really do at 2 in the morning, 6 hours into a drive. The CB crackled at 2:17. I know the time because I just looked at the clock on the dash, one of those old analog setups with the orange needle, calculating how many hours remained. The crackle was sudden enough that I sat up straighter, the way any unexpected sound in a quiet car will straighten your spine, and I looked at the unit under the dash and saw the signal light on it pulse once and hold. I assumed it was a trucker. Channel 19 is the standard highway channel, and that stretch of I-40 had enough freight traffic even at that hour that picking up a trucker's conversation wasn't surprising. I'd been passing semis periodically all night. I waited for the shorthand, the 10 codes, the mile markers, the brief clipped exchanges about road conditions or way stations that make up the working vocabulary of CB communication, and instead what came through was a voice speaking in a low, unhurried conversational register, the way you speak when you're not announcing yourself to a channel but telling something to a specific listener. The voice was a man's, middle range, unhurried, with a flatness to the affect that I placed without being sure why, as someone from the Mid-South, not the deeper drawl of Mississippi or Alabama, not the mountain inflection of Tennessee proper, something in between. He was describing a truck. I understood this gradually, the way you parse language when the words are familiar but the context isn't assembling correctly. He was describing a vehicle. Older model, he said. Full-size Ford. Faded red, he said, or thereabouts, hard to say in the dark. Heading westbound. And then a detail that pulled me fully, coldly upright in my seat. He said the truck had a crease along the passenger door. Long crease. Old damage. My right hand tightened on the wheel. I looked in my mirrors. There was a semi behind me, maybe a quarter mile back. Ahead of me, nothing for as far as the headlights reached. To my left, the median. To my right, the shoulder, and then darkness. I could not see, from inside the cab, whether anyone was alongside me or close behind in a position to see through my windshield. The voice continued. He described someone driving alone. He got the general build right, not specifically the way you describe someone you know, but in the approximate language of someone making a visual assessment from a distance, the kind of description that could apply to a type and happened to apply to me. Then he said something that closed the distance between possible and impossible. He said the driver had one of those little pine tree things hanging off the mirror. 2 of them, actually. I did not move. I did not reach for the CB. I kept both hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road, and I took a breath through my nose and let it out and tried to think about what I was doing with my body, because my body was doing things on its own. My heart had accelerated to a rate I was aware of in a way you usually aren't, and my hands had gone tight on the wheel with a pressure that was starting to ache in my knuckles, and some part of my peripheral vision was working very hard on both sides of the truck, trying to locate the source of the voice. He said the driver had been drifting left on certain road seams. He said it like an observation, like a detail that completed a picture he was assembling. I knew what road seams he meant. I-40, through that stretch, has a longitudinal seam in the pavement where repairs were made at some point, a long ridge that runs parallel to the lane, and when your left tires cross it, the truck pulls slightly. I'd been correcting for it. I'd been correcting for it unconsciously, the way you do when you've been driving long enough that adjustments happen below the level of thought. He had been watching me long enough to notice a habit. He was close enough to see through my windshield. The pine trees, the seam correction, both of those required a sight line into the cab. Not from behind, not from a distance. From alongside, or from slightly ahead, at an angle that let him look back into my face and down at my hands on the wheel. I thought about the semis I'd been passing all night. The ones where I'd pull alongside to pass and glance up at the cab out of habit. I thought about whether any of them had looked back. I thought about whether looking back was the same as what this was. The voice stopped. The signal light pulsed once and went dark, and the CB went to its baseline static hiss. Just like that. Mid-thought, no conclusion, no sign-off. As if he'd said what he wanted to say and was done with the saying of it. I drove for another full mile before I reached for the CB. My hand found the transmit button, N, and I held it, T, and I opened my mouth, and then I let the button go without speaking. I did not know what I would say. I did not know what channel he was on, whether he'd hear me, whether responding was the thing that told him I'd been listening. I did not know if he was already aware that I was listening, or whether my silence had given me some protection I didn't fully understand. And I was afraid to trade that uncertainty for certainty. By announcing myself, I let the button go and put my hand back on the wheel. I moved to the left lane and held it, which let me watch the right lane and right shoulder with my peripheral vision without it being obvious that I was watching. There was a semi about half a mile ahead that I'd been slowly gaining on a standard double trailer configuration, running lights in the standard pattern. I watched it as I approached, watched the cab. When I came alongside it, I looked up at the driver's window, the way you do. The curtain was pulled. I couldn't see in. I passed it and watched it fall behind me in the rear view. W and I did not feel any different. I stopped in Memphis. I didn't need gas, but I needed to be somewhere with lights and other people and concrete, and the particular reality of a truck stop at 2:30 in the morning. The smell of diesel and floor cleaner, and the flat overhead brightness of commercial fluorescence. I parked under the canopy, sat for a moment, and looked at the CB under the dash. I thought about calling Ray. It was the middle of the night, and he would answer. Because he always answers, but I didn't know what I would tell him. I didn't know how to describe what had happened in terms that would communicate what it had felt like to hear a man describe my truck from the inside while I sat in it. To hear him notice the pine trees. To hear him notice the way my hands corrected for the seam. I went inside, bought coffee, stood at the counter, and watched the parking lot through the windows for 10 minutes before I got back in the truck. I didn't see anything. That didn't make me feel better. Not seeing wasn't the same as not there, and I understood that now in a more physical way than I had before. I drove the rest of the way to Missouri without the windows down. I kept the CB's signal light in my peripheral vision for every mile of it, and it did not come on again. I arrived at my destination in the early morning, gray-skied and still, and I sat in the driveway for a while before going inside. On the drive home 2 days late, RI took a different route. I told Ray it was for variety. He nodded and didn't ask more, which is his way. The CB is still in the truck, as far as I know, still set to channel 19, calibrated the way he wants it. I've thought about asking him whether anything like that has ever happened to him, whether he's ever picked up something on that channel that wasn't what it should have been. But Ray is a man who, if the answer were yes, would have already said so, and if he hasn't said so, there's a reason, and I've decided that the reason is probably one I don't need to add to the things I carry. What I know is this. Somewhere on I-40 inches western Tennessee, there was a man with a radio and a sightline into my cab, and he watched me long enough to learn my habits, and he described me to whatever audience he had with the patience of someone who had done this before, who was comfortable doing this, who did not need me to respond to make it worth doing, whether I was a curiosity to him or something else. I can't say. I don't know how long he'd been watching before the radio came on. I don't know whether the radio coming on was an accident of range or a decision. I don't drive that stretch at night anymore. I can't offer a better reason than that, and I've found I don't need one. I have an unusual name. I want to establish that first because it matters to everything that follows. It is not a name that gets guessed. It is not a name that sounds like something common if you hear it quickly and misparse it. It is a name my mother chose, from a book of names she'd had since childhood. A name with a specific ethnic origin that makes it rare in the American South. A name that, when I introduce myself to someone new, I have learned to say slowly and then repeat because the first pass rarely lands correctly. People spell it wrong. People hear it and attempt approximations that share maybe two of the syllables. People who have known me for years occasionally still mispronounce it when they're not paying close attention. It is not a name that a stranger guesses. I've driven the corridor between Roanoke and my home in eastern Tennessee more times than I can count. It's the route to my brother's place, to the part of Virginia where I went to school, to the stretch of the Blue Ridge where a group of my oldest friends has ended up settling into adult lives. I know that drives the way you know a road you've traveled enough that your body anticipates the curves. I know where the elevation changes, where the signal drops, where the rest stops are, and which ones are worth stopping at, and which ones feel wrong in the particular way that some isolated places feel wrong after dark. The one just past the state line into Tennessee is not a bad rest stop as these things go. It's a larger facility, two separate buildings, a covered walkway between them, a dog walk area fenced off to one side, a decent number of lights in the parking lot that actually function. I'd stopped there before on this same drive. It felt about as neutral as a place like that can feel at midnight, which is to say, not comfortable exactly, but not alarming, just a rest stop, just a necessary pause. I pulled in a little after 12. I'd been driving since 9, and my eyes were doing the thing they do around the 3-hour mark on night drives, where they're technically focused but not quite fully processing, registering the road without really reading it, which is the stage before tired that I've learned to take seriously. I parked in the middle section of the lot, away from the two semis that were idling at the far end with their running lights on, away from the minivan parked near the dog walk with its rear windows fogged from whoever was sleeping inside. The lot was otherwise empty. I used the restroom, which was clean enough, and washed my face at the sink with cold water for longer than necessary, which is the closest thing I have to a road reset. I looked at myself in the mirror, the look of a person who has been driving too long, hollowed a little around the eyes, the particular expressionlessness that fatigue and solitude produce. And I told myself 3 more hours, which was true. 3 hours and I'd be home. I'd done worse. I stopped at the vending machine on the covered walkway between the buildings. I wasn't hungry. I wasn't thirsty in any specific way. I stopped because I had quarters, and because the act of selecting something and watching it drop gave my hands something to do, and my mind something small to occupy itself with. I bought crackers in a yellow sleeve, the kind I wouldn't eat, and turned back toward the parking lot. He came into step beside me, approximately halfway across the walkway. I didn't see where he'd come from. That's the part that I've turned over most since, the part that doesn't settle. I hadn't seen anyone in the walkway when I was at the vending machine, hadn't heard a door open behind me, hadn't registered approaching footsteps. He was simply there, the way things are there when you're tired and not fully attending, appearing at the edge of your vision as if they'd always been there and you'd simply not focused on them. He was walking at my pace, matching it, close enough to be in conversation range, but not so close as to make the invasion of space obvious. Middle-aged, I thought. Average height, slightly soft through the middle, wearing jeans and a dark jacket, and a ball cap with a logo I didn't recognize. Nothing remarkable about him. The kind of person you would not remember if you passed him on a sidewalk. A forgettable person. That is not a cruel thing to say, it is a precise description of his quality, the way certain people have a kind of visual anonymity that's almost a characteristic in itself. He said something. The vending machine behind us was still running through its cooling cycle, a loud mechanical hum, and the idling semis at the end of the lot were producing their constant low throb, and between those two sounds, I caught the tone of his voice, but not the words. I did what you do. I turned my head slightly toward him and said, "Sorry." I didn't catch that. He repeated himself. He said my name. My full name, first and last, in the correct sequence, with the correct pronunciation of the first name, the emphasis on the right syllable, the middle vowel, given its proper sound, the kind of precise rendering that I associate with people who have heard me say it myself or have seen it written out with the pronunciation guide. He said it the way a person says a name they know. Not carefully, not slowly, not with the hesitant approximation of someone attempting an unfamiliar word. The way you say the name of someone you are addressing. I stopped walking. He stopped a half step ahead of me and turned around, and I had a full look at his face in the parking lot light for the first time. It was an ordinary face. No particular quality to it that I could identify then or now as meaningful, no feature that stood out, no expression that I could read clearly. He was looking at me with the mild, slightly squinting look of someone examining a face for recognition, and he said that he thought he recognized me. He asked if I'd gone to school in a town whose name I didn't recognize, a small town, he said, in the county it was in, which I also didn't recognize. He said it like it was a reasonable question, like we were at a gathering and working through mutual connections, like this was the normal conversational project of placing an almost familiar face. I told him no. I hadn't gone to school there. I didn't know the town. He nodded. It was a slow nod, the kind that means something is being processed and adjusted, and he said that must be why he almost had it wrong. Almost. He let that word sit there between us for a half second, and then he said, "Well, sorry to bother you. Have a safe drive," and turned and walked back toward the far end of the lot, toward the semis, his hands in his jacket pockets, unhurried. I stood in the middle of the parking lot and watched him go. I watched him until the shadows at the far end of the lot absorbed him, until I could no longer distinguish his outline from the dark and the shapes of the trucks. I stood there with the crackers in my hand in the cold Tennessee night coming down through the mountain. And I waited to understand what I was feeling. What I was feeling was not the sharp spike of immediate threat. It was something slower and more corrosive, the dawning of a question that I couldn't answer, spreading through my thinking the way cold water spreads through a cloth. He had said my name, correctly, both parts. In a parking lot in Tennessee at midnight, a man I had never seen before had turned to me and used the full name that my mother gave me and pronounced the first part right on the first try. I got in my car, I locked both doors, I sat with the engine off and my phone in my hand, and I went through every social media account I maintain. This took longer than you might expect because I was thorough. I went into the settings of each one individually, checked the privacy configuration, and verified what was visible to people who were not in my network. Every account was private. Every account had been private for years, because I work in a field where the advice to lock down your online presence is given early and taken seriously. My name does not appear in any of my handles or usernames. I do not appear in tagged photos that are publicly visible. A person searching my name in a public search would find nothing attached to my face. Nothing that would tell them what I looked like or where I was driving on a Tuesday night in the summer. I thought about the other explanations. I have a somewhat common last name, not the most common, but common enough. I thought about whether the first name could have been a coincidence, whether he could have said something adjacent to my name that I had interpreted as my name, because it was late and I was tired and I expected to hear something. I ran this theory through the specific memory of it, the syllables, the emphasis, the vowel he'd given correctly that no one gets correctly, and I could not make it fit. He had said my name. He had said it correctly. I could not construct a version of events in which that was accidental. The word had almost left me. Must be why he almost had it wrong. As if what he'd had was information that was mostly right but contained one error. The school, the town, whichever detail he'd used to identify me. As if he'd been working from a source that was accurate about my name but wrong about one other particular. As if someone had told him what to call me, had given him enough to find me in a parking lot, and had gotten one thing wrong. I thought about who that source could be, and I found I couldn't think about it for long without the thinking becoming something I needed to stop. I drove the last 3 hours without the radio. I drove them in a silence that was not restful, in the particular quiet of a person working through something they cannot resolve. The mountains gave way to the plateau, and the plateau to the valley roads I knew well, and I arrived home at close to 4 in the morning, and sat in my own driveway in the car for a while because being inside the car still felt like being inside something that was at least defined, at least boundaried, before I went into the house and sat in the kitchen until daylight. In the weeks since, I have been through my accounts again. I have tightened every setting I could find. I have searched my own name in the ways a stranger might search it and found nothing that would tell them my face. I have asked a small number of people who know me well whether they've shared my information with anyone, and the answers were no, uniformly and without hesitation, in a way that told me the question was coming from somewhere that alarmed them. I don't know who the man in the ball cap was. I don't know how he knew what to call me. I don't know who gave him the information he was working from, or why one piece of it was wrong, or whether being wrong about the school means he was wrong about me, whether he approached the wrong person, and my name is a coincidence, so unlikely that I cannot hold it in my head without it collapsing, or whether he knew exactly who I was, and the school was a script, an opening, a way of making contact that had its own logic I can't access. What I know is that he said my name. He said it correctly. And then he said, almost, and walked back toward the dark. I don't stop at that rest stop anymore. I don't stop at any of the rest stops on that corridor after dark if I can avoid it. I've adjusted my schedule so that I make that drive in the daylight, which has cost me convenience and time, and I have decided that is a trade I'm willing to make for as long as I need to make it, which may be a long time, which may be the rest of my life. Almost. The word turns up at odd hours, when I'm tired or driving or sitting in a quiet room. I don't know what was almost right. I don't know what he would have done if he'd had it exactly right. I'm not sure I want to know. I'm not sure knowing would make it better. And I've decided that uncertainty, uncomfortable as it is preferable to the alternative, which would be understanding exactly what I was to that man in that parking lot on that particular night. Some doors I have chosen to leave closed. That is one of them. I had been driving since before the sun came up, which means by the time I saw the motel signs, I had been behind the wheel for somewhere between 11 and 12 hours, with one stop for gas and a second stop at a rest area where I'd eaten a bag of pretzels in my car and stared at the middle distance for 15 minutes before deciding I was functional enough to continue. That assessment, I can say now, was optimistic. The drive had started in Indiana, a family matter that required my presence and then required my departure on the same day. The kind of day that uses you up by noon and keeps asking for more in the afternoon. I was heading back to Tennessee, which in ordinary circumstances is a drive I don't mind, through the gentle rolling farmland of central Kentucky and then into the more interesting terrain of the South. But the day had left me hollow in the specific way that emotionally difficult days do, where the fatigue isn't just physical, it's in some deeper register, the kind that makes your thoughts slow and repetitive, and your responses to the world around you slightly delayed, as if you're receiving everything through a half second of lag. I'd told myself I would stop in Bowling Green. That was the plan. I'd looked at the map before I left and identified Bowling Green as a reasonable endpoint, a city large enough to have chain hotels where I could use points and not think about it, and I'd held that destination in my head as the finish line for the day. But somewhere north of there, I'd made a wrong choice on an interchange, ended up on a state route instead of the interstate, and by the time I understood what I'd done and found my place on the map, Bowling Green was behind me and receding, and the route I was on was threading through a part of rural Kentucky that I didn't know well, 2 lanes, no median, the kind of road where the county maintains the asphalt but not generously. I need to be honest about the state I was in. My eyes were doing something I've only experienced a few times in my life, staying open but not quite seeing, registering light and motion without fully processing it, so that I was nominally watching the road but in a way that an observer might have found alarming if they could see my face. I knew I needed to stop. I had known it for the better part of an hour. I was in the negotiation that tired drivers have with themselves in the dark, the one where you keep extending the deadline by increments 10 more miles, 5 more miles, just to the next town, and the towns kept being smaller than the map suggested. A post office and a church and a grain elevator and nothing else. No lights, no lodging, no reason to stop. The motel signs appeared at the edge of my headlights, like something the road had decided to offer me. There were 2 of them, the kind of tall roadside signs on poles that you used to see everywhere before the chains standardized everything. The first said motel with an arrow. The second, closer to the turn, gave a name I won't attempt to reproduce because I've since come to doubt my memory of it. Something with the word valley, or something like it, 2 words, painted in a once bright script that had faded to legibility without going to illegibility. And below the name, the word vacancy, with the illuminated box behind those letters still functioning, casting a pale yellow light onto the gravel of the turnoff. I pulled in without reviewing anything. I want to be clear about this, because it matters. I am the kind of person who reads reviews. I am the kind of person who checks a property's photos and rating before I commit to a room. I did none of that. I pulled into the lot, which was cracked asphalt softened by age and a long stretch of summer heat, and I parked in front of the office and turned off the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden quiet and felt the enormous relief of a person who has been moving too long and has finally stopped. The motel was single-story, an L-shaped building of the kind that was standard design in the 50s and 60s, rooms along the outside, doors facing the lot, a covered walkway with a low sloping roof over the row of doors. Painted a color that might have been cream or pale yellow, hard to say in the lot's minimal lighting. The parking lot had maybe 3 other cars in it, scattered, no particular clustering. Room numbers were mounted above the doors in metal letters, the kind that are screwed individually into the wood and that lose members over the decades until the numbers become ambiguous. The office was at the corner of the L. A woman was at the desk, older, compact, wearing a cardigan despite the summer heat, with the efficient, unsurprised effect of someone who has worked a front desk long enough that nothing about a late arrival registers as unusual. She had a ledger open on the desk, actual paper, which I noted and didn't think much about. She asked how many nights. I said 1. She wrote something. She said the card reader was down, cash only, and named a rate that was low enough to be surprising but not low enough to feel wrong. The rate of a place that hadn't updated its prices in a while, rather than the rate of a place that was trying to get you to overlook something. I paid. She gave me a key on a plastic fob, the old style, a diamond-shaped piece of yellow plastic with the room number impressed into it, the kind you used to return at checkout and that have mostly been replaced by cards. Room 7, she said checkout was 10, and that was the whole of our conversation. I thanked her, and she had already looked back at the ledger. Room 7 was the 4th door down the long arm of the L. I let myself in and stood in the doorway for a moment with my hand on the switch. The room was clean. I want to say that clearly because it is true, and because in the context of everything else it seems important. The room was plain and modest in the way of older budget lodging, with a double bed and a pressboard dresser, and a bathroom with a tub rather than a shower stall, but it was clean. The sheets had that particular tight tuck of a recently made bed. The floor had been swept. The bathroom smelled of the specific disinfectant that older motels use, which was not unpleasant. There was a window unit air conditioner under the window that functioned when I turned it to low and put out cool air with a steady mechanical rumble that I have always found conducive to sleep. I set the alarm on my phone for 7, which gave me roughly 6 hours. I lay down on top of the covers because I was too tired to bother pulling them back. I was asleep, I think, within minutes, the kind of sleep that takes you quickly and completely, without the usual negotiation of finding a comfortable position or letting the thoughts of the day run down. The room was cool and dark, and I was gone. My alarm went off at 7, and I woke up feeling better than I had any right to. That's the thing I remember most clearly about those first seconds. The quality of the rest, how complete it was, how I came up out of sleep without the usual residue of dreams, or the thickness of having slept too hard. I lay there for a moment in the cool air and listened to the room and felt, for the first time in the whole of that long day, genuinely okay. I washed my face, gathered the few things I'd taken out of my bag, and opened the door into the morning. The light was the first thing, that particular quality of early morning in the rural South, before the heat has fully asserted itself, when the air is still and slightly blue and the shadows are long. I stood in the doorway and looked at the parking lot and the long arm of the moat, and something was wrong before I understood what was wrong, the way you notice an absence before you identify what's missing. My car was in the lot. The other cars I'd seen the night before were gone. The motel office was at the corner of the L, its window facing the lot, and the window was dark. Not closed and curtained dark. Dark in the way of a space that has been dark for a long time. The interior blackness of a room that doesn't receive light because the light was removed from it some time ago. I walked toward it because I needed to check out and return the key. Why in the mind will insist on routine, even when the information coming in has started to suggest that routine is not the appropriate response. The door to the office was padlocked. A hasp and lock arrangement, the hasp screwed into the door frame and the door itself, the padlock through the loop, and the whole assembly had rusted into itself in the particular way that metal rusts over years rather than months, the reddish brown of long oxidation, the texture of something that had been locked and then forgotten. I put my hand on the padlock and felt its weight and its roughness and the absolute certainty of its age, and I stood there with my hand on it for a moment, while my understanding of the previous 8 hours began to do something unstable. I looked in through the window. The grime on the inside of the glass was the particular gray-brown accumulation of a space that hasn't been cleaned in years, not the surface dust of a closed room, but the deep coating of long vacancy, the kind that makes the glass go translucent rather than transparent. Through it, I could see the room. The floor was linoleum, buckled at the edges where moisture had gotten under it over time, lifted in the curling way that linoleum lifts when a building goes without heat through enough winters. There was no desk, no chair, no ledger, no lamp, no vacancy sign. The room was empty, not emptied, recently empty in the way of a space that has held nothing for a very long time. I went back and stood in front of room 7 and looked at it. The door was closed, the way I'd left it. The number above it was still there, the metal 7 still attached. I tried the handle, and the room was still unlocked, still holding the residual coolness of the window unit's work the night before. The bed was made with that tight institutional tuck. The bathroom still smelled of disinfectant. My own presence in the room was confirmed. I could see the slight impression on the bed cover where I'd slept, the damp towel on the rack where I'd used it. I stood in the doorway of room 7 and looked at the locked and rusted office, and I held the plastic fob in my hand and tried to make the two things cohere. The room where I'd slept was real. The sleep had been real. The key in my hand was real, yellow plastic. The number impressed into it, the slight warmth of it from my pocket. The office where the woman had given it to me was a room that had been empty and locked for what the rust and the linoleum and the grime on the glass suggested was years, not hours. I drove away. I didn't know what else to do. I got in my car, R and I left the lot, and I found the interstate. E and I drove to Tennessee, and I sat in my own house for a long time before I did anything else. The fob is on my desk as I write this. I've looked up the address printed on it, a small printed label on the back, the motel's name and a street address. The address exists. I've looked at it on satellite maps. I've looked at it in Street View. I've even driven past it once, 6 months after that night, on a trip that took me near enough to that part of Kentucky that I couldn't talk myself out of going. The address is a vacant lot, grass growing through cracked concrete, a few scrub trees at the edge of it, and at the back of the lot, barely visible, the concrete foundation of a building that used to stand there, its outline describing an L shape, the kind of shape a single-story motel might leave behind if it had been demolished. If it had been gone long enough for the lot to go to grass, and the foundation to go to moss, and the memory of it to go to whatever place memories of small rural businesses go when they close, and the people who use them have moved on. I slept well that night. That's the part that I can't make sense of, the part that sits wrong no matter how I approach it. 6 hours in a clean room with a functioning air conditioner, and I woke up rested, genuinely rested, better than I'd slept in months. Whatever that place was, whatever it had been, or still was, or existed, as in that particular darkness on that particular night, it gave me that. It gave me a bed that was made, a clean room, a door that locked, and a night of sleep that carried me through the next 2 weeks in a way I hadn't expected. I don't know what to do with that. I have tried gratitude and found it unsettling. I have tried fear and found it incomplete. I have tried the simple explanation that I was so tired. I hallucinated the woman and the transaction, and my mind constructed the memory of a check-in to wrap around the reality of pulling into an empty lot and sleeping in my car. And I have held the key in my hand while I tried it, felt the plastic, read the number, and found I couldn't make it hold. The key is real. I sleep with it in the drawer of my nightstand now. I'm not sure why. Some instinct that I should keep it, that it might matter, that whoever or whatever gave it to me extended something that deserves acknowledgement, even if I don't have language for what that acknowledgement should look like. I just know I'm grateful for the sleep, and I know I'll never go back. And I know those two things can both be true, and that the space between them is where whatever happened lives, and I've decided to let it stay there. There is a specific quality to the last hour of a very long drive that I don't think gets talked about honestly. People describe it as relief, as the finish line, as the part where you can finally exhale, and there is some of that. But there is also something else, a lowering of the defenses that have been holding you together for however many hours you've been moving, a loosening of the particular vigilance that night driving requires, and that loosening can be its own kind of vulnerability. You stop watching as carefully. You start living slightly ahead of yourself, already in your driveway, already inside your house, already horizontal, and the road you're still physically on becomes almost theoretical. I've made mistakes in that last hour that I didn't make in the hard middle of a drive. I think most people have. I want to say that because I want to be fair to myself about what happened. I want to be honest that I was not at my most careful. I was 40 minutes from home. The sky above the tree line to the east had started its first movement from black toward the deep blue-purple that comes before any real light. And I had been driving for 14 hours with one real stop and two short ones. And I was managing it, but just barely, running on the particular fuel of proximity to home that kicks in when you're close enough to feel it. I was on the interstate that cuts through the lower parishes of Louisiana, the flat coastal plain corridor I've driven so many times. I could navigate it with the radio off and my eyes half closed, which is approximately the state I was in. I'd left my friend Garrett's place in northwestern Arkansas the previous afternoon. A visit that had run longer than planned, the way visits always do when you haven't seen someone in a year, and there's too much to cover, and the time keeps slipping. I'd made good time across Arkansas and into Louisiana, lost some of it in Shreveport, where construction had compressed 4 lanes to 1 for a stretch of highway that felt like it would never end, and made the rest of it back on the long, flat run south. The drive was familiar. I knew every interchange, every significant curve, every stretch where the trees pressed close on both sides and then opened suddenly onto a bridge over one of the rivers or bayous that crossed the corridor. I knew this road. That's what I keep coming back to. I knew this road. The exit sign appeared in my headlights at 4:47 in the morning. I know the time because I'd looked at the clock 60 seconds earlier, doing the arithmetic of distance and time that you do compulsively in the final stretch of a long drive. 40 minutes, I'd calculated, maybe 38. The exit came up in the way exits come up on an interstate. You see the green sign advance in your headlights, read it as you pass beneath it, let the information register as either relevant or ignorable. This one registered as wrong before I'd fully read it. The name on the sign was not a name I recognized, which, in this corridor, is unusual. I know the exits the way I know the turns in my neighborhood, by feel and sequence and what they mean. And an unfamiliar name in a familiar sequence pulls the attention, the way a missing step pulls the foot. I read it as I passed beneath it, tried to place it, found nothing. A town name, 2 words. The kind of construction common in this part of Louisiana, the kind that combines a French or Spanish element with a geographic suffix, but not one I'd seen before. I looked in the rearview mirror. The exit was there, the ramp curling off to the right, rising slightly before bending into the tree line, and at the top of the ramp, visible from the interstate, a single overhead light on a pole casting its cone of yellow-white illumination onto the empty road below. One light. The ramp was otherwise unlit. The trees began where the light ended, and were total after that. No ambient glow from any town or structure beyond the tree line. No indication of what the road beyond the ramp connected to. I faced forward and drove. I told myself it was a small exit, a parish road exit, something that served a handful of properties, and that I'd simply never had occasion to register. Some exits you pass without seeing for years because they're not yours, and your eyes have learned to skip them. This was a reasonable explanation, and I accepted it and kept driving. 1 mile past the exit, my GPS rerouted. I should explain my GPS setup because it matters. I run a navigation application on my phone, mounted on the dash, and I use it on long drives, even on routes I know. W because it gives me real-time traffic, and I've learned to trust it for that even when I don't need it for directions. The application is one I've used for 6 years. I know its behaviors. I know what it does when it recalculates. I know the sound it makes. I know the visual language of its rerouting animation. What it does not do, what it has never done in 6 years, is reroute without a triggering event. It reroutes when there's traffic ahead, when there's an accident, and when I've made a turn it didn't anticipate. It does not reroute on a clear highway at 5 in the morning when I am traveling my planned route without deviation. The screen changed. The route line shifted. The application's voice told me to take the next exit and continue to my destination via the recommended route. The next exit, the one coming up in approximately a mile, would double me back northbound and bring me back to the exit I'd just passed. I ignored it. This happens sometimes. The application makes a suggestion I don't take, and it adjusts. I stayed in my lane. The next exit appeared, and I passed it. The screen changed again, and this time it was different in a way that stopped my breath for a half second. Not a rerouting animation, not the standard recalculation, but a dialog box. A small rectangular pop-up in the center of the screen with text in it. This application does not produce dialog boxes during navigation. I have used it for 6 years. In 6 years of daily use across 30 states, it has never produced a pop-up dialog during active navigation. The interface doesn't include that functionality. No mechanism in the application's normal operation generates an interrupting dialog box. The box said, "You missed the recommended exit. Rerouting." I read it twice. I read it in the way you read something that shouldn't be there, looking for the misparse, the way the tired eye turns one word into another. It said what it said. I reached out and touched the screen to dismiss it the way you dismiss any pop-up, pressing the area outside the box. And the box closed. And the map was there again, recalculated, and I looked at where it was routing me. And I looked longer than I should have while driving because what was on the screen required looking at. The new route went back to that exit, down the ramp, onto whatever road lay beyond the tree line. And I traced this with my finger held close to the screen without touching it. Following the route line, the road went some distance into the trees. A mile perhaps 2. And then it stopped. Not at an intersection. Not at a named destination. The road simply ended on the map. At the end of it, there was a small symbol I had to enlarge the map to read. And when I enlarged it, I saw a dead-end marker, the standard T-bar symbol, and beside it, where a road name or destination label would normally appear, a question mark. Plain, unformatted, a gray question mark on the map where the name of the place should be. I turned the application off. I pressed the button on the side of my phone to go to the home screen, and I set the phone face down on the passenger seat, and I drove. I drove the remaining 37 minutes with the phone face down and the GPS off and the radio off and both hands on the wheel at a position slightly higher than I usually hold them. The way your hands find the wheel when your body is preparing for something without consulting you about what. The sky continued its movement from purple toward the first gray of morning. The interstate was empty in both directions. I passed exits I knew recognized their signs, their sequence, the landmarks that attend them, and the familiarity of them was something I held on to with more deliberateness than usual. I did not look at my phone again until I was in my own driveway, with my car in park, the engine off, and the garage door closed behind me. Then I turned it over and opened the navigation application and went to the route history, which the application logs, and I looked at the route I had driven. The route was there, the exits I'd taken, the miles I'd covered, the timestamp of the drive. The rerouting events were logged, 2 of them, at the times I remembered, at the locations I remembered. The exit they referenced was not on the map. I zoomed in on the location where I remembered seeing the sign, where the rerouting had told me to go. The interstate was there. The mile markers around it were there. There was no exit, no ramp, no overhead light. The map showed an uninterrupted interstate for the stretch of road where the sign had been, where I had watched in my rear view as the ramp curved up toward the trees, and the single light made its cone of yellow on the empty asphalt. The rerouting events in my log referenced a road designation, a parish road number that I wrote down on a piece of paper, and have since searched in the Louisiana Department of Transportation's public road database. In the parish's own road records, in historical maps of that corridor going back 30 years. The number does not correspond to any road in the parish. It does not correspond to any road in any of the adjacent parishes. It is a number in the correct format for a Louisiana parish road, assigned according to the correct naming convention, attached to nothing that exists on any official record I have been able to access. I've driven that stretch of interstate 4 times since that morning, twice in daylight, twice at night, and I have not seen the exit. I've driven slowly in the area where I remember it being, watching the shoulder, watching for any indication of a ramp or an access road, or the kind of break in the tree line that would suggest something connecting to the interstate. There is nothing. The tree line is continuous. The interstate runs straight through without interruption. What I cannot resolve, and have stopped trying to resolve, is the question of what the route was for. The application wanted me to go there twice, with increasing insistence, the second time in a way that exceeded its own functionality. Whatever was at the end of that road with no name and a question mark where the destination should have been, something wanted me to see it. Something generated a behavior that 6 years of daily use had never produced to tell me I had missed my turn. I didn't take it. I turned the screen over, and I drove home in the early morning. G and I sat in my garage for a while before going inside, and I have not taken that drive at night since then, and I do not plan to. But I think about the light at the top of the ramp. The single overhead light, casting its cone down on the road, makes the empty asphalt glow. I think about how it was the only light visible beyond the interstate, how the trees were totally dark after it, how there was nothing beyond it that I could see, how inviting a single light can look at 5 in the morning after 14 hours of driving, how reasonable it might seem to take the ramp, to follow the road, to let the navigation lead you to wherever it had decided you were supposed to go. I think about the question mark at the end of the road on the map. I think about what it would mean to arrive somewhere that the map couldn't name. I think about whether the map's uncertainty reflected its own incomplete data, or whether it reflected something true about the place itself, that it was genuinely, essentially unnamed, existing outside the systems that organize and label and make the world legible. I was 40 minutes from home. The sky was going purple at the edges. I was tired enough to make mistakes, and alert enough to know I was making them, and that balance, that particular knife's edge of the last hour of a very long drive, is where whatever that exit was, found me. I'm glad I kept driving. I am not entirely sure why I'm glad, except that I am, in the way you're glad about something you don't fully understand, in the way your body knows things before your mind does. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you listen.